How does the secret mistress of Bob Hope go from a luxury Hollywood penthouse to selling her body for $5 in the gutter? Barbara Payton made the fatal mistake of believing her youth could manipulate a cowardly superstar 24 years her senior. She was playing a dangerous game, completely blind to the wrath of his untouchable wife, Dolores Hope. 18 years older than the young homewrecker, the Catholic matriarch didn't scream or fight. She just set a trap. And once Barbara stepped inside, she was completely destroyed. The trap was the secret arrangement itself. Confined to a hidden apartment funded by Hope, Barbara was systematically starved of the professional momentum he had promised. As the agonizing silence of her isolation grew unbearable, she realized she was being kept hidden rather than elevated. Barbara decided to force the issue. She possessed a blinding maverick beauty and a dangerous surplus of ambition. If the legendary comedian would not give her the public validation she craved, she would find it elsewhere. She stepped out of the shadows and into the glaring neon lights of the Sunset Strip. She began frequenting Kiro's and the Macombo, the elite nightclubs where the Hollywood hierarchy congregated. She wanted to be seen. She wanted to remind the industry that she was a highly desirable commodity. This was a fatal miscalculation. She believed that generating public attention would increase her value to Bob Hope. She thought making him jealous would force him to claim her publicly. She did not understand the pathology of the men who ran the studios. They did not value women who demanded attention. They valued women who knew their place. By making herself visible, Barbara transitioned from a managed secret to an active liability. She quickly attracted the attention of two completely different men. Franchot Tone was a wealthy, highly respected, and established actor. He was older, sophisticated, and offered Barbara a veneer of legitimate Hollywood royalty. He took her to expensive dinners. He allowed them to be photographed together. He offered the public visibility that Hope vehemently denied her. Then came Tom Neal. Neal was a former amateur boxer and a B-movie actor with a reputation for intense, brooding aggression. He was a brute. He offered a raw, visceral danger that appealed to Barbara's reckless nature. He did not care about studio politics. He operated on pure physical impulse. Barbara began juggling both men. She played them against each other with the reckless confidence of a woman who believes she is invincible. She orchestrated public encounters. She fueled their mutual jealousy. She thought she was manipulating them. She believed that having powerful, famous men fighting over her elevated her status. It was the ultimate delusion of the Hollywood homewrecker. She thought she was the player manipulating the board. She was merely the poker chip about to be cashed out. The studio fixers at Paramount watched the situation escalate with cold, clinical detachment. They monitored her movements. They tracked who she dined with and who she went home with. The reports made their way back to the executive boardrooms. The verdict was unanimous. Barbara Payton was entirely out of control. Bob Hope received the warnings from his handlers. The situation was approaching critical mass. The press was beginning to sniff around the edges of the love triangle between Payton, Tone, and Neal. It was only a matter of time before a hungry journalist connected the dots back to the secret apartment and the married, wholesome comedian who paid the rent. Hope reacted exactly as Dolores knew he would. He panicked. He did not step forward to protect the woman he had claimed to care for. He did not use his immense power to shield her from the impending media storm. He executed a cowardly, tactical retreat. He simply stopped visiting the apartment. He stopped answering her calls. He cut the communication lines cleanly and efficiently. He retreated into his fortress of moral hypocrisy, leaving Barbara entirely exposed on the battlefield she had carelessly created. He did not officially break up with her. That would require a confrontation, and Bob Hope avoided confrontation at all costs. He utilized the weapon of total silence. He let the financial support dry up. He left her stranded in a high-rent lifestyle with no income and a rapidly deteriorating reputation. He threw her to the wolves simply to ensure his own pristine image remained untarnished. Barbara felt the sudden, terrifying absence of her protector. The safety net was gone. She was entirely dependent on Franchot Tone and Tom Neal to maintain her status. The rivalry between the two men turned toxic. They were highly possessive, deeply insecure men operating in a town built on fragile egos. They began issuing public threats. They stalked each other. The tension on the Hollywood circuit was palpable. Everyone knew a collision was inevitable. Barbara continued to fuel the fire. She promised herself to Tone, then spent the night with Neal. She operated with a destructive, chaotic energy. She was trying to secure a permanent anchor in a city that was actively preparing to drown her. She did not realize that when men in Hollywood go to war over a woman, the men do not get destroyed. The men shake hands afterward, trade war stories, and continue booking leading roles. The woman is the only casualty. The woman is branded a whore, a troublemaker, and a career killer. The executives at the major studios prepared the paperwork. The public relations machines went on high alert. Dolores Hope attended a high-profile charity luncheon, smiling serenely for the cameras, her status absolute and unshakable. Bob Hope booked another tour to entertain the troops, projecting the image of a selfless, dedicated patriot. The architects of Barbara Payton's destruction were entirely insulated from the coming blast. The stage was set on a quiet, manicured Hollywood street. The two men finally crossed paths in the physical world. The psychological warfare was over. The violence was about to begin. And the studio bosses waited by their telephones ready to drop the guillotine the moment the first drop of blood hit the pavement. The collision occurred in the dead of night on a pristine, manicured lawn in the Hollywood Hills. It was a spectacle of raw, unhinged male ego, masked as romantic passion. Tom Neal arrived at Barbara Payton's residence heavily intoxicated and violently territorial. He intercepted Franchot Tone. The confrontation did not involve witty, cinematic dialogue. It was a brutal, asymmetric slaughter. Neal was a former amateur boxer with fists like cinder blocks. Tone was an older, refined actor, accustomed to stage combat, not street violence. Neal unleashed a savage beating. He shattered Tone's cheekbone. He pulverized his nose. He delivered a severe concussion that sent the older actor into a deep coma. Blood soaked into the expensive imported grass. The horrific sounds of bone crushing against bone echoed through the quiet, affluent neighborhood. Barbara Payton watched the carnage unfold. A fatal delusion clouded her judgment. She looked at the blood and the broken bodies and genuinely believed she was witnessing the ultimate validation of her own extreme desirability. She thought the violence proved her immense worth. She believed that a woman worth bleeding for was a woman who could command the entire industry. She failed to comprehend that she was not Helen of Troy, launching 1,000 ships. She was simply a liability standing at ground zero of a massive public relations disaster. The men were not fighting for her soul. They were fighting for possession of a highly visible object. The violence was a display of their own profound insecurities. Barbara stood in the aftermath of the brawl entirely unaware that the violent incident on her lawn effectively ended her viability as a leading studio asset. The sun rose over Los Angeles and the tabloids descended like a swarm of locusts. The story was a journalistic goldmine, a beautiful blonde bombshell, two famous actors, a brutal, near-fatal brawl. The headlines screamed across every newsstand in America. Photographs of Franchot Tone wrapped in heavy hospital bandages were plastered next to glamorous promotional shots of Barbara. The scandal fed the insatiable public hunger for Hollywood sleaze. The public devoured the details eagerly, but the men who truly controlled the city did not read the tabloids for entertainment. The studio executives read the tabloids to assess corporate risk. In the executive boardrooms of Paramount and Warner Brothers, the reaction was swift, silent, and lethal. The men in tailored suits did not panic. They executed standard operational procedures. A scandal of this magnitude threatened to expose the intricate network of lies that sustained the entire studio system. The executives looked at the situation and immediately identified the contagion. Franchot Tone was a victim of a brutal assault. He would be protected. Tom Neal was a violent thug, but he was a male actor who could eventually be rebranded as a rugged anti-hero. The men would be quietly shielded by the patriarchal structure of the industry. Barbara Payton, however, was a young, expendable female contract player. She was the catalyst. She was the homewrecker. She was the highly visible target that could easily absorb the totality of the public outrage. The decision to sacrifice her required zero deliberation. The studio bosses did not convene a formal tribunal. They did not summon Barbara to an office to explain herself. The Hollywood blacklist is not a physical document. It is a highly efficient shadow network. It is activated through a series of short, quiet phone calls between powerful men smoking cigars. A studio head calls a casting director. A producer calls an agent. The message is transmitted with absolute clarity. The girl is finished. Do not hire her. Do not associate with her. Do not return her calls. The professional execution is finalized entirely off the record. For Barbara, the execution was invisible until she felt the blade slice through her life. She woke up the morning after the scandal expecting the phone to ring with offers. She thought the massive surge in public visibility would translate into box office demand. She believed infamy was just another form of celebrity. She sat in her luxury apartment waiting for the industry to bow to her newfound notoriety. The phone remained completely dead. Her agent stopped answering her calls. The scripts that were supposed to be delivered by courier never arrived. The gate pass that allowed her entry onto the studio lots was abruptly revoked. She was essentially erased from the institutional memory of Hollywood overnight. Panic is a cold, creeping sensation. Barbara realized the machine was shutting her out. The oxygen was being sucked out of her career. She needed a lifeline. She needed a man powerful enough to override the studio executives and force them to lift the invisible ban. She turned her desperate attention toward the one man she believed truly owed her. She dialed the private, unlisted number of Bob Hope. She expected the legendary comedian to step forward. She expected the man who had funded her secret life to leverage his billion-dollar empire to rescue her from the wolves. The telephone rang in an empty room. Bob Hope was not going to answer. The moment the scandal broke, the superstar executed a masterful, cowardly retreat. He understood the structural dynamics of his own power better than anyone. His entire empire rested on the foundation of his wholesome, family-friendly image. He was the wisecracking, patriotic husband. If the press discovered that he was the secret benefactor of the most notorious homewrecker in America, the backlash would destroy him. The sponsors would pull their funding. The television networks would cancel his contracts. He did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He completely severed the cord, connecting him to Barbara Payton. He threw her to the studio executioners without a single glance backward. He retreated deep into the fortified bunker of his marriage and locked the door. Dolores Hope stood inside that bunker, observing the slaughter from a safe, elevated distance. The 18-year age gap between her and the young bombshell meant absolutely nothing. Dolores wielded the terrifying power of institutional legitimacy. She watched her husband cower behind his public relations team. She felt no pity for the young woman currently being eviscerated by the press. Dolores understood the brutal, unwritten laws of the elite class. The mistress always pays the bill when the king makes a mistake. Dolores did not have to hire lawyers or issue threats. She simply maintained her immaculate poise. She attended a highly publicized charity gala on the arm of her smiling husband. She wore heavy diamonds and projected an aura of serene, untouchable grace. Her silence was not submission. Her silence was a weapon of mass destruction. By refusing to acknowledge the scandal, she denied it any oxygen. She allowed the corporate machinery of Paramount to crush the threat on her behalf. The contrast between the two women was a stark, brutal lesson in power dynamics. Dolores was insulated by lawyers, publicists, and massive financial trust. She was entirely safe. Barbara was standing naked in the center of a media hurricane. She possessed nothing but her physical beauty, and that beauty was rapidly becoming a massive liability. The studios recognized that her face was now inextricably linked to violence and sleaze. She was box office poison. The financial reality of the blacklist hit Barbara with devastating speed. The luxury apartment that Bob Hope had secretly funded was suddenly entirely her responsibility. The rent was astronomical. The bills for her extravagant lifestyle began to pile up on the entryway table. The custom dresses, the expensive jewelry, the nights out at elite clubs all required a constant, heavy flow of cash. Barbara had no savings. She had spent everything under the assumption that the Hollywood machine would endlessly replenish her bank account. She suddenly realized she was completely broke. The illusion of her leverage shattered entirely. She was not a player manipulating the system. She was a deeply indebted asset that had just been aggressively foreclosed upon by the bank. She tried to fight back. She tried to leverage the scandal into independent film roles. She accepted cheap, exploitative parts in terrible B-movies, trying to generate enough cash to stay afloat. But the major studios controlled the distribution channels. They ensured that any film featuring her name received minimal exposure. They choked off her oxygen supply. They wanted her to starve. They needed to make a very public example of her. The system required a sacrifice to demonstrate what happens to female talent that disrupts the established order. The brutal fistfight was the crime, but the punishment was entirely directed at the woman who sparked it. Franchot Tone recovered from his coma. He was treated with profound sympathy by the press. He was the tragic victim of a brutal assault. He returned to his lucrative acting career without missing a step. Tom Neal, however, was blacklisted alongside Barbara. The major studios abhorred uncontrollable violence as much as they abhorred scandal. Neal was reduced to poverty row films and eventually landscaping, completely exiled from the elite circles he fought to dominate. But while Neal's destruction was a byproduct of his own brutality, Barbara's execution was an industry mandate. Barbara Payton received no such forgiveness. She was a woman who had dared to play the game with the exact same ruthless ambition as the men, but she lacked the structural armor to survive the blowback. The double standard was absolute and lethal. The men walked away from the blood-stained lawn with their careers entirely intact. Barbara was thrown into the gutter. The psychological toll of the blacklist was instantaneous. Barbara realized that the powerful men she had courted and manipulated viewed her as completely disposable. The laughter and the promises whispered in dark nightclubs meant absolutely nothing. She became completely isolated within an industry that aggressively moved on. The profound isolation drove her toward the only remaining escape routes. If she could not find validation in front of a camera, she would find numbness at the bottom of a bottle. She began to drink heavily. The alcohol dulled the sharp edges of her immediate panic. It blurred the reality of the unpaid bills and the silent telephone. She was a rapidly sinking ship. The elite circles that had once welcomed her now viewed her with toxic revulsion. She was a cautionary tale. Actresses crossed the street to avoid being photographed near her. Directors, who had previously praised her talent, now pretended they had never met her. She was socially and professionally radioactive. The empire Bob Hope had built continued to expand. He signed massive new television contracts. His face was plastered on billboards across the country. He was universally beloved. His PR team worked relentlessly to craft an impenetrable shield of morality around him. Every laugh he generated from a studio audience was another nail driven into the coffin of Barbara Payton's career. He bought his pristine reputation with her total destruction. She sat in the luxury apartment waiting for the eviction notice. The walls that were supposed to be her sanctuary had become her tomb. She looked in the mirror and saw the exact same face that had captivated the world just months prior. The bone structure was flawless. The eyes were hypnotic, but the power behind the beauty was completely drained. She learned the hardest truth of the Hollywood machine. Physical beauty is merely a depreciating currency. Capital leverage and institutional protection are the only things that ensure survival. Her attempt to navigate the upper echelons of the studio system without institutional backing ultimately resulted in her complete professional exile. The descent from the penthouse to the pavement was about to begin, and there was no one left to break her fall. The eviction did not happen with a dramatic confrontation or a screaming match. It was executed with the same cold, clinical efficiency that characterized every operation within the studio system. The luxury apartment that Bob Hope had secured for Barbara Payton was technically leased under a dummy corporation managed by Paramount fixers. The moment the scandal erupted and Hope retreated into his bunker, the corporation simply ceased paying the rent. A week later, men in cheap suits arrived with boxes. They did not care that Barbara possessed one of the most recognizable faces in the country. They were repo men acting on silent orders from the executive boardrooms. They stripped the apartment bare. They took the custom furniture, the imported rugs, and the expensive art that had decorated her gilded cage. Barbara stood in the center of the empty living room. The silence of the space was deafening. This was the physical manifestation of the blacklist. The Hollywood machine was systematically liquidating her existence. She packed her remaining clothes into suitcases and walked out the door. There was no safety net. The massive power disparity between the ruined actress and the legendary comedian highlighted the savage inequality of the system. She now understood that he was simply leasing a young, depreciating asset, and the lease had just been brutally terminated. She descended from the exclusive elevation of the Hollywood Hills and checked into a cheap, transient motel on the flat, gritty expanse of Sunset Boulevard. The geographic plunge perfectly mirrored her plummeting social stock. She refused to accept that the execution was final. She possessed the relentless, desperate ambition of a woman who had climbed out of obscurity and refused to return to it. She attempted to hustle. She dressed in her finest remaining clothes, applied her makeup with meticulous precision, and began visiting the independent producers operating on the fringes of the industry. These were the poverty row studios, the bottom feeders, who produced cheap, fast exploitation films. In the past, they would have begged for 10 minutes of her time. Now, the reception was universally hostile. She walked into casting offices and witnessed the invisible wall of the blacklist firsthand. Producers literally turned their backs when she entered the room. Casting directors suddenly lost her headshots. The rejection was not based on her talent or her physical appearance. The rejection was a mandate from the men who controlled the distribution networks. If a poverty row producer hired Barbara Payton, the major studios would ensure that producers' film never saw the inside of a theater. She was a radioactive commodity. No one was willing to risk their own financial survival to throw her a life preserver. The corporate cannibalism of Hollywood was functioning exactly as designed. The system was starving her out. While Barbara was pacing the stained carpets of cheap motels, the Paramount public relations machine was working overtime to sanitize Bob Hope. The cowardice of the superstar was staggering. He did not issue a single statement regarding the woman whose life was currently being dismantled because of their association. He simply vanished into a meticulously scheduled itinerary of wholesome public appearances. The studio executives understood that the American public possesses a remarkably short memory if they are distracted by the right narrative. They flooded the national magazines with heavily curated photo spreads of the Hope family. Meanwhile, Dolores maintained her impenetrable facade of marital unity, attending high-profile Catholic charities and smiling for the cameras while allowing the studio machinery to handle the fallout. She knew that her public appearances alongside her husband provided him with the ultimate institutional armor. Her presence communicated a clear message to the public and the press. The family unit was intact, the rumors were irrelevant, and the superstar was a man of unimpeachable moral character. Dolores wielded her silence like a scalpel. She cut away the scandal by simply refusing to acknowledge its existence. She allowed the studio to completely destroy the younger woman, securing her own position at the absolute pinnacle of the Hollywood aristocracy. She did not need to confront the mistress. The corporate machine was doing the dirty work on her behalf. The contrast between the two camps was sickening. In the same month that Barbara Payton was pawning her jewelry to pay for a motel room, Bob Hope was honored at a lavish industry banquet. He stood at a podium wearing a tailored tuxedo and delivered a speech filled with self-deprecating humor and patriotic platitudes. The audience, composed of the same executives who had ordered Barbara's professional execution, gave him a standing ovation. They applauded his resilience. They praised his status as a national treasure. The hypocrisy was absolute. The man who had funded a secret apartment for a young starlet and then abandoned her to be devoured by the press was officially crowned the husband and father of the year. His pristine reputation was purchased directly with Barbara's total destruction. The psychological devastation of this double standard broke Barbara's mind before it broke her body. She realized that the rules of engagement in Hollywood were rigged entirely in favor of the men who controlled the capital. Franchot Tone, one of the men whose violent public fistfight had triggered the entire catastrophe, faced 0 permanent consequences. Tone was treated as a tragic victim and resumed his lucrative acting career. Tom Neal faced industry exile for his uncontrollable brutality. Yet, the industry narrative simply discarded Neal while actively protecting Tone, framing the violence as an unfortunate clash of men while focusing the absolute punishment exclusively on the woman. Barbara received no forgiveness. She was a woman who had dared to step outside the rigid, submissive boundaries assigned to female contract players. She had demanded agency. She had played powerful men against each other. For this crime, the punishment was absolute exile. She was locked out of the only industry she knew. The profound isolation was suffocating. She was a ghost walking through a city that worshipped fame. People recognized her on the street, but they did not ask for autographs. They stared at her with a toxic mixture of pity and revulsion. She had become a cautionary tale. The financial strangulation accelerated. The pawn shops took her designer dresses and her remaining jewelry for fractions of their actual value. When the cash ran out, the alcohol was no longer sufficient to numb the panic. Alcohol was a social lubricant. Barbara needed an eraser. She needed a chemical compound strong enough to obliterate the memories of the red carpets, the flash bulbs, and the false promises whispered in the dark by Bob Hope. She found the eraser in the shadows of the Sunset Strip. She transitioned from champagne to heroin. The introduction of the needle marked the point of no return. Heroin did not just dull the pain. It actively dismantled her remaining ambition. It replaced the desperate hunger for a film role with a singular biological demand for the next fix. The drug stripped away her vanity. The flawless bone structure that had once commanded millions of dollars at the box office began to hollow out. Her skin took on a gray, sickly pallor. The glamorous 1950s bombshell was rapidly mutating into a street-level addict. The Hollywood machine had achieved its primary objective. They had neutralized the threat. Barbara Payton was no longer a beautiful, ambitious liability who could potentially embarrass a prime asset. She was a ruined addict self-destructing in the gutters of Los Angeles. The executives in the boardroom stopped monitoring her file. She was officially classified as a solved problem. Bob Hope continued to tour the world, accumulating staggering wealth and universal adoration. Dolores Hope continued to reign over her social empire, her hands completely clean of the blood that had been spilled to protect her status. The architects of the savage betrayal had won a total victory, but the descent was not yet complete. The cruelest irony of the Hollywood blacklist is that it does not kill its victims quickly. It forces them to endure a slow, agonizing degradation in full view of the city that rejected them. Barbara had lost her career, her home, and her dignity. The only asset she had left to liquidate was her physical body, and the streets of Los Angeles were waiting to collect the final payment. The introduction of a chemical narcotic into the bloodstream of a blacklisted actress is not a tragic accident. It is the final, entirely predictable phase of a systematic corporate execution. The men who controlled the Hollywood studio system understood the psychological architecture of their talent perfectly. They knew that an actress like Barbara Payton, who had been fed a steady diet of global adoration, flashbulbs, and the intoxicating proximity to supreme power, could not simply transition into a quiet, ordinary existence. When the machine abruptly cut her oxygen supply, the resulting vacuum in her mind had to be filled. The executives did not need to physically hand her a syringe. They simply stripped away her identity, her income, and her dignity, and let the crushing weight of total isolation drive her toward the darkest corners of Los Angeles. Heroin is the ultimate liquidator of ambition. It does not merely numb the pain of a destroyed career, it actively rewrites the biological priorities of the human brain. For Barbara, the drug erased the agonizing memory of the luxury apartment, the red carpets, and the false promises whispered by Bob Hope. The desperate hunger for a leading role in a major motion picture was rapidly replaced by a singular consuming demand for the next fix. The chemical compound dissolved her vanity. The flawless bone structure that had once commanded the attention of the most powerful men in America began to hollow out into a gaunt skeletal mask. Her luminous skin took on the gray, sickly pallor of the streets. The glamorous 1950s bombshell, who had once believed her physical allure could conquer a multi-billion-dollar industry, was mutating into a ghost. The financial reality of a severe narcotic dependency operates on a brutal, accelerating timeline. The pawn shops had already consumed her designer wardrobe and her expensive jewelry. The cheap motels demanded daily cash rates. The drug dealers did not offer credit based on her former celebrity status. Barbara had absolutely zero liquid capital. The underground blacklist had ensured that she could not earn a legitimate wage, not even in the most degrading low-budget productions. The studio bosses had starved her out completely. She possessed only one remaining asset that she could physically trade for the chemicals she required to survive the day. The corporate cannibalism of Hollywood had pushed her to the absolute edge of the abyss, and then gravity took over. The descent reached its terrifying absolute bottom on the asphalt of Hollywood Boulevard. The geographical irony was staggering. This was the exact same pavement where her massive film premieres had once been held. She had previously arrived on this street in chauffeured limousines, stepping out onto red carpets while thousands of screaming fans fought against police barricades just to catch a glimpse of her face. Now, she was walking that same street as a predator's prey. The Hollywood machine had literally forced a silver screen goddess out of the penthouse and onto the corner to function as a streetwalker. The transactions were executed in the shadows of the neon signs, far away from the camera flashes. She sold her body to anonymous passing strangers. The price for a woman who had once been the secret obsession of the highest paid comedian in the world dropped to $5 a trick. The men who pulled their cars into the dark alleys and paid her this pathetic sum did not know they were purchasing the discarded property of the Hollywood elite. They did not care about her cinematic legacy. They were acquiring a temporary, depreciated object. Every transaction conducted in the shadows of Hollywood Boulevard was the ultimate physical manifestation of her complete destruction. The ego that had once believed it could topple a Hollywood marriage was entirely annihilated in the back seats of strangers' cars. While Barbara was freezing on the street corners, engaging in desperate transactions to stave off chemical withdrawal, Bob Hope was executing multi-million-dollar television syndication deals. The massive power disparity between the ruined actress and the legendary comedian highlighted the savage inequality of the system. Hope had utilized his decades of entrenched capital and institutional armor to completely insulate himself from the fallout. He was an untouchable titan. The Paramount Public Relations Department functioned as his personal Praetorian Guard. They relentlessly flooded the cultural airspace with images of his wholesome, philanthropic superiority. Bob Hope did not lose a single night of sleep over the woman he had abandoned. He did not suffer a moment of professional hesitation. He appeared on television screens in the windows of the very appliance stores that Barbara stumbled past during her nightly hunts for cash. He stood on brightly lit stages, delivering rapid-fire jokes to roaring audiences, radiating the smug, impenetrable confidence of a man who knows his sins have been completely expunged by the corporation. His cowardice was rewarded with staggering wealth and universal societal reverence. He was a moral black hole disguised as a national treasure. He had purchased his pristine, unblemished legacy using Barbara Payton's total eradication as the currency. Dolores Hope reigned supreme over this empire of hypocrisy. The contrast between the elite matriarch and the destroyed mistress proved definitively that institutional staying power will always crush temporary physical leverage. Dolores had executed a masterclass in upper-class sociopathy. She had not shed a single tear. She had not engaged in a vulgar public confrontation. She had not lowered herself to acknowledge the existence of the younger woman who had attempted to infiltrate her domain. Dolores sat in her sprawling, heavily fortified estate, a devout Catholic draped in diamonds, managing massive philanthropic trusts. She possessed a terrifying, cold-blooded intellect. She understood that by maintaining her absolute silence and projecting an image of unshakable marital unity, she forced the studio system to act as her personal executioner. The Hollywood executives could not allow Bob Hope's image to be tarnished, which meant they could not allow Dolores' marriage to fail. Therefore, the threat had to be neutralized. Dolores did not have to lift a finger to destroy Barbara Payton. She simply allowed the massive grinding gears of the capitalist machine to do the slaughtering for her. She was the undisputed alpha female of the Hollywood aristocracy, a woman whose power was so absolute it was entirely invisible. The studio executives in the boardrooms had completely closed Barbara's file. They no longer monitored her movements or tracked her associates. The blacklist had achieved a 100% success rate. They did not view her degradation on Hollywood Boulevard as a tragedy. They viewed it as a successful risk management operation. They had excised a tumor from their prime asset. The fact that the tumor was a living, breathing human being was irrelevant to the bottom line. The machine had protected the brand. Barbara was entirely erased from the collective memory of the industry. The directors who had once praised her raw talent pretended she had never existed. The actors who had once vied for her attention looked the other way if their limousines happened to drive past her on the street. She was a living ghost, a horrific cautionary tale meant to terrify any other young contract player who might harbor delusions of challenging the established patriarchal order. She was the physical proof that the men in the tailored suits owned everything: the cameras, the banks, the press, and the very air the actors breathed. The cruelty of her daily existence was absolute. The street-level survival barely covered the cost of the heroin required to keep her body functioning. Her health deteriorated at a terrifying velocity. She suffered from exposure, malnutrition, and the constant grinding physical trauma of life on the streets. She was beaten by the men who bought her. She was arrested by the police officers who were paid by the studios to look the other way when the male stars misbehaved. She was trapped in a relentless, agonizing cycle of chemical need and physical degradation. The woman who had once demanded a seat at the highest table of the Hollywood elite was now completely subjugated by the lowest, most violent elements of the city. The trap Bob Hope had set when he first offered her that luxury apartment had snapped shut permanently, and the teeth of the trap were deeply embedded in her veins. The ultimate victory of a corporate monopoly is not merely defeating an adversary. It is ensuring that the adversary's destruction is so absolute, so physically and psychologically total, that their very existence is scrubbed from the institutional memory. The Hollywood studio system did not just fire Barbara Payton. They executed a prolonged, highly choreographed financial and biological slaughter. The descent from the heavily guarded luxury apartment financed by Bob Hope to the darkest, most predatory corners of Los Angeles was now complete. The blacklist had functioned flawlessly as an invisible garrote. It choked off her capital, her social access, and finally, her basic human dignity. She had attempted to wield raw physical beauty against a multi-billion-dollar cartel, and the cartel responded by grinding her into a fine, worthless dust. The geography of her final days was a brutal testament to the efficiency of the underground blacklist. The woman who was once the highly classified obsession of the most powerful comedian in America did not reside in a home. She occupied transient, decaying spaces. She occupied the filthy, unlit corners of cheap motels where the walls were stained with the residue of countless other desperate, anonymous failures. The glamour of the 1950s bombshell had been completely liquidated. The flawless, hypnotic visual symmetry that had once commanded the attention of the global press was gone, replaced by the hollow skeletal mask of end-stage narcotic dependency. Her organs were systematically shutting down, poisoned by the very chemicals she used to erase the agonizing memories of her stolen future. The contrast between her physical reality and the reality of the man who had initiated her downfall was sickening. As Barbara lay shivering in the squalor, her body actively failing, Bob Hope was ascending to the absolute zenith of global cultural supremacy. He was insulated by armies of publicists, lawyers, and studio executives who aggressively maintained his pristine, patriotic facade. He stood on brilliantly lit stages, accepting Lifetime Achievement Awards, his bank account swelling with unprecedented television syndication revenue. He was universally revered as a paragon of American virtue. The profound cowardice of this man was the bedrock of his empire. He never looked back. He never deployed a fraction of his immense wealth to secure a quiet, safe existence for the woman he had discarded. He understood that acknowledging her, even in secret, would introduce a catastrophic risk to his personal brand. He traded her life for his legacy without a second of hesitation. Every round of deafening applause he received from the Hollywood elite was a direct endorsement of his savagery. The system rewarded his cowardice because his cowardice protected the corporate bottom line. He bought his immaculate immortality using the currency of her complete eradication. Dolores Hope stood beside him, the silent, terrifying architect of this total victory. She demonstrated the lethal power of an upper-class alpha female who understands that true supremacy requires absolute emotional discipline. She never lowered herself to engage in a vulgar physical confrontation. She never screamed. She never granted a tearful interview. She recognized the fundamental truth of the Hollywood hierarchy. The machine is designed to protect the legitimate wives of prime assets and eliminate the trespassers. By maintaining an impenetrable facade of marital unity, she forced the studio bosses to act as her personal executioners. Dolores did not need to soil her manicured hands with the blood of the mistress. She simply sat in her sprawling, heavily fortified estate, managing philanthropic trusts and dictating the social calendar of the Los Angeles aristocracy. She watched the capitalist machine devour the younger woman and spit out the bones. The final contrast between the untouchable matriarch and the ruined bombshell proved definitively that youth and sexuality are utterly useless against entrenched institutional leverage. Dolores won the war through the sheer, terrifying force of her silent indifference. She erased the threat by refusing to acknowledge that the threat was even human. The final moments of Barbara Payton's life contain no cinematic redemption. There was no tearful apology from a powerful man. There was no sudden influx of cash or a miraculous rescue from the studios. There was only the cold, unforgiving surface of a dirty linoleum floor. The system had squeezed every ounce of value from her image, punished her for her ambition, and left her to die in absolute, terrifying isolation. Her internal organs, ravaged by the relentless exposure to the streets and the toxic chemicals required to numb the trauma, simply collapsed. She died surrounded by the squalor of poverty, while the men who had utilized her body and destroyed her career slept securely in palatial estates, their wealth compounding in offshore accounts. The crumpled bills she had collected from anonymous predators on Hollywood Boulevard lay nearby, the final pathetic net worth of a woman who had once believed she could conquer an empire. The Hollywood cleanup crew did not need to issue a press release to spin the narrative. Her death barely registered a tremor in the executive boardrooms of Paramount or Warner Brothers. They had neutralized the liability years ago. Her passing was merely the belated physical conclusion to a professional execution that had been ordered during a quiet phone call between powerful men. She was swept away with the trash, a completely destroyed entity, serving as a silent, invisible warning to any other woman who dared to forget her place in the machinery of the elite. History, written exclusively by the victors who control the bank accounts, recorded Bob Hope as a legendary hero while Barbara Payton was left to rot as a forgotten footnote of corporate cannibalism. Barbara Payton was pushed out of penthouses and forced onto the pavement to sell her body for $5 bills. But if you believe that financial strangulation is the absolute peak of Hollywood cruelty, you are severely underestimating the savagery of the studio system. Cutting off a woman's money is merely a standard operational procedure. Sometimes, starvation is not enough. In the next video, we will examine how the Hollywood elite deploy a far more terrifying arsenal. We will look at how they utilize forced injections, toxic chemicals, and the locked wards of mental asylums to completely obliterate the brain of a leading lady who dared to rebel against the machine. The psychological and physical slaughter of Frances Farmer is next. Do not forget to hit subscribe to step through the next door of elite hell.